Hello and welcome to this two-part presentation on the topics of prejudice and stereotyping. In these presentations, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these two concepts, related concepts of prejudice and stereotyping. We're going to see how they are connected to other aspects of social interaction and social cognition and how they relate to education. In this first part of the presentation, we're going to be focusing on stereotyping. And then in the second part, which is a separate recording, we're going to be looking at prejudice. When we talk about stereotyping in this presentation, what we're going to do is, firstly, we're going to look at the way that stereotyping emerges out of other more everyday social processes and forms of social cognition. We're going to look at the way that stereotyping can often influence our judgment and that it reflects at some level a desire for social distance between us and the group that we're stereotyping. Furthermore, we're going to look at some of the features of stereotyping, such as the things that help to maintain it, often in the face of facts which contradict it, and aspects of stereotyping such as positive stereotyping and what they mean. Finally, we're going to look at how stereotyping relates to education. We're going to see how stereotyping can affect the way that we approach education and how, if we're not careful, education can often serve to sort of perpetuate certain stereotypes. But we're also going to look at the practical things that we can do as educators to minimize or manage stereotyping. It's very important that we remember that for any process, any concept in psychology, that concept or process doesn't exist in a bubble. That is almost always connected to and sometimes is a product of other concepts and other processes. And stereotyping is no exception. To understand stereotyping, you have to understand the processes that are connected to it, and one of those processes is self-categorization theory. This is how we place ourselves and everybody else into social categories. We decide which categories we belong to, and if we meet somebody, we decide which categories they belong to. Now, this is something we do as an essential part of establishing our own social identity, but also what we would call normal everyday social interactions, to be able to interact with people as quickly as we do in normal everyday behavior and as effectively as we do, placing them in social categories and then sort of deciding how to interact with them based on, okay, you're a member of that category. I guess I know now what kind of behaviors are typical and what sort of things I should say or shouldn't say to you. So if I meet somebody and I realize, oh, right, this is a police officer I'm talking to, I immediately have a shorthand, a kind of a set of basic notes that I can work off to help me decide how I react to that person and how I interact with them. And in order to do this, we have to have a sort of a set of notes for each social category of what somebody in that category is like. And we tend to organize these notes into a representation of a prototypical member of that category. It's not a real person, it's a sort of an imaginary person, and we give that imaginary person all of the characteristics that we think a typical member of that category will have. And then when we meet somebody new and we realize, oh, you belong to that social category, we then use that prototype as a shorthand for what kind of behaviors and characteristics should we expect from this person. It's almost like we fit the prototype to them and go, okay, you've probably got some or maybe a good number of these characteristics. Now, in doing that, we are able to then interact with this person very effectively and very quickly. So doing that, essentially comparing somebody against a prototype and expecting them to be similar to that prototype because they belong to that category, is not a bad thing. However, we need to always remember that firstly, the prototype is not a real person, that nobody in that group may match the prototype. It's an imaginary kind of combination of characteristics that some people in the group will have. Some of them, others people in the group will have other characteristics, but there probably won't be anybody in the group who has all of the characteristics of the prototype. That's one thing we need to remember. We also need to remember that this person we meet will also not match the prototype exactly. They'll have some of the characteristics of the prototype if they belong to the category that the prototype comes from, sure, but they won't be a perfect match for it. Now, where we run into difficulty and where we can often begin to stereotype people is when we forget that. When we start to imagine that everybody within the group has all the characteristics of the prototype, and when we start to tell ourselves that if we meet a new person and we realize, oh, you belong to that social category, We start to stereotype when we expect that new person to have all of the qualities of the prototype, which nobody will have. And it's when we start to do that, that's when we start to stereotype. So in a nutshell then, stereotyping occurs when we take the prototypical image we have of a member of a certain social category and we apply that prototypical image indiscriminately to everybody in the category. In effect, we convince ourselves that everybody in the category shares all of the characteristics of the prototype, which is never true. But once we start to believe that, we have started to stereotype people in that category. Now you might think that everyday experiences of meeting people in that category would sort of soon burst that bubble, but it's interesting, and we'll see more about this later on, how our other cognitive processes get distorted by the stereotype, and so we will often notice things which are more consistent with the stereotype and not notice things that are not. And even when we notice things that are not consistent with the stereotype, we're less likely to remember them, and we're more likely to remember things that fit in with the stereotype. And in any situation which is ambiguous, and lots of social situations are, we're more likely to interpret the ambiguity in a way that's consistent with the stereotype rather than one that contradicts it. We're not doing this deliberately. It's not that we're sort of bad people or have malicious intent. It's just that these processes are affected by the stereotype and so become less reliable. Another interesting thing about stereotyping is that often stereotypes are stronger in situations where the group is perceived as an out-group, sort of something, the opposite of the group we belong to, or not us, and there's a competition between the in-group, the one we belong to, and the out-group. Now this doesn't have to be going on right now. It can be something that's happened in the past. If there are historical events where a particular group of people at one time were viewed as an out-group, the competition or the opposite to the group that we are, the group that we belong to, then we'll tend to have stronger stereotypical images of that group. And in fact, when you consider some of the nationalities for which the British have very strong stereotypical images of what people in that nationality are like, you can match a lot of them back to past enemies, past sort of opponents or people we were competing or had conflicts with. And it's likely that the stereotypical image we have of that nationality will have a strong connection with that past conflict or conflicts. Right, it's time for an activity now. Imagine for a moment that you're sitting on the Board of Governors for a school and you're reviewing two applicants, the sort of best two applicants you've received for the position of a teacher in information technology and computing. Okay, the two candidates that are the best ones of all the ones that have applied to you are Clive and Steve, and you can see details about them up on the slide here. And you can imagine that apart from the stuff you see on the screen here, pretty much everything else about them is the same. And so neither one has any information that isn't on the screen here that would be hugely relevant to your decision. As such, what I want you to do is I want you to pause the recording for a moment, have a think about it, and then decide for yourself, who would you hire? Now, don't spend too much time thinking about it. See if you can make a rapid decision and just go with your instincts on which one is the better choice. Now, once you've made that choice, then interrogate it. Ask yourself, okay, why did you pick that person? Can you think, if you were asked to justify, could you justify the reasons? Whichever one you picked, after making arguments in favor of them, could you, if you had to, make arguments in favor of the other candidate, the one you didn't pick? So if you were forced for some reason to make a case for them, could you do it? So pause the recording and have a go at doing this yourself. See how you get on, make a few notes. And then when you start the recording again, I'll talk about some of the things that might have had an impact on your decision making. Right, hopefully you've had a go at this yourself and you'll have picked one of the two candidates and you'll have come up with a few reasons for yourself as to why you picked the person you picked. Here's a few things to look out for. Firstly, if you picked Clive, or if you were making a case for Clive as the person to be picked, were any of the arguments that you made anything to do with the idea that Clive might be considered to be a more mature person, more stable, more patient possibly? Would you have used any of the words sort of, wiser or patient or easygoing? Now, if you have done or anything else like it, it's probably because Clive is older. And we have this image of older people being wiser. With age comes wisdom. We also tend to see them as less sort of hot-tempered, more sort of mellowed and easygoing because they are older. You might also think that Clive has more experience because he has lived longer, because again we assume with age comes experience and with sort of age comes wisdom. On the other hand, if you picked Steve or were making a case for Steve, you might have used ideas or concepts along the lines that Steve might be more up to date, that essentially he may be more able to deal with the latest technologies, the newest ideas more than Clive is. And this is to do with the fact that Steve is younger, and we tend to assume that younger people have more mental flexibility. They're able to change more, they're able to learn more, they're able to deal with new things better than older people are. And so you might have thought to yourself expressions like, about teaching an old dog new tricks. Now, whichever side you picked, or whichever reasons you gave, if any of them match the ones I'm describing here, what's happening is that the age of the candidate is affecting your decision making. And some of the reasons that you may have come up with, or that other people might come up with in a similar situation, could be affected just as much by our stereotypes of age as what is actually going on when we get older. How will I know if I'm viewing a group of people stereotypically? Well, if you remember, I said that we stereotype when we take any prototypical image we have of a group of people, a social category, and we apply that prototypical image indiscriminately to every member of the category, expecting them to all have all of the qualities of the prototype. So if I can ever spot myself doing that, it's a good chance that I'm stereotyping. What about the example of age, as I've discussed previously? Well, I know that for many people, becoming elderly is the prototypical image of an elderly person can often be summed up by what's called the 4Ds, decline, depression, delirium, and dementia. And these are the things that we think are likely to be a problem once you become old. And as such, our prototypical image of an elderly person will have some or even all of these qualities. Now, is it right for me to think or expect that an elderly person will have all these qualities? Well, there's research out there suggests that while these are problems which are more common in the people who are in later years of life, there's plenty of variability. For example, there are many people who report improvements in their cognitive functioning, particularly in the areas of divergent thinking or problem solving or creativity as they get older. So again, that shatters the idea that every person who is older or might be considered elderly will have a decline in their cognitive functioning. There are also people who make a case for what they believe is successful aging, and that say that the view of an inevitable decline in later life is exaggerated and that it's possible to maintain good health and good mental health and good cognitive functioning throughout their lifespan. And what this suggests to us is that to assume that every person who is older or might be considered elderly will have these problems, all of them or any of them, is a stereotype, because not everybody in the category of elderly people will have these issues. And so if we apply them to every member of the category, we are stereotyping. Another interesting point which has been put forward about this particular social category of the elderly or growing older is the argument that we should start to separate out in our minds the idea of becoming older and aging. So if you want to think of aging as the term that describes the change in your physical ability or the change in your mental or emotional state, whether that's a good change or a bad change, that could be aging. However, that might occur completely independently from how old you are. As such, you may get older, you may gain in years, but you may not age. Your physical or mental functioning may not change. And as such, we shouldn't assume that once we know how old somebody is, we know how much they will have aged, because we don't. If we separate getting older and aging, they don't happen to the same people at the same time. I think this is an idea that intuitively we can get behind, because we may know people who seem to not age for years and years and years, and then something happens and rapidly they appear to get older in our eyes. And I think what some people would argue there is that they have aged rapidly, whereas the time before that they were getting older, but they weren't aging. All of this goes to show that we should be very careful when applying a prototype to any group, even a group that we might think we know well, such as people who are older or the elderly, because if we apply it indiscriminately, we are likely to engage in stereotyping. It may be a mistake to view stereotyping solely in terms of it being a malfunction, something going wrong. Yes, I do believe it is us taking something, social categorization and self-categorization, and using it incorrectly. But I would be careful not to view this as simply a mistake. It may be that stereotyping has a function. If you remember, one of the aspects of self-categorization and social categorization is social distance, that often we like to create very clear boundaries between social groups and social categories, make it very clear who is us and who is not us, in-group and out-group. And often we will, in our own minds, exaggerate how similar everybody in the in-group is to each other, because that creates a sense of the group being similar and tight-knit and cohesive, and we like that in the groups we belong to. But we also tend to view the out-group as being more similar to each other, because that way we can be more confident that there's no one in the out-group who's similar to us. If they're all similar to each other, and that thing that they're all similar to is different, then we can be very confident, yeah, you are definitely all in the out-group, none of you might be in the in-group, much more confident of the social distance between the in-group and the out-group, and the in-group therefore feels more well-defined, clear boundaries. And in that sense, a stereotypical image of the out-group serves a function in that it further enhances, it makes it, the out-group appear even more consistent, because everybody in the out-group is exactly the same. And in doing so, we enhance our sense of difference and distance between the in-group and the out-group. And that allows us to feel more confident and comfortable in the group that we belong to. But also, if the out-group is something we are not comfortable with, we dislike, we're afraid of, it makes us more confident that we're not in that group. Not only are they not in our group, but we're definitely not one of them. And you could, if you look at the example I've been using, which is the elderly, you could understand why people might want to create a stereotype or maintain a stereotype of the elderly, because it then allows them to feel more confident they're not one of them. It allows us to kind of distance ourselves from our own mortality, the sense that we are all getting older and inevitably will die. Well, if I've defined the elderly as being a certain type of person, and I believe everyone who's elderly has these characteristics, but I don't, then, hey, I'm not old yet, and I can therefore distance myself from that kind of unpleasant thing that may happen to me in the future. It's interesting how people do this, and you might think, well, does it change the way they behave? And it does. We find that the other interesting thing about stereotyping is how often it is linked to prejudice. Now, we'll talk about prejudice more in the next session, but in a nutshell, prejudice is about treating people differently based on which social categories they belong to. And we can see plenty of examples of how stereotyping and prejudice seem to go hand in hand. Again, the example I'm using of the elderly, a stereotypical image of the elderly will often go hand in hand with ageism, treating people differently because of their age. And so often we will treat people differently because we believe they are older and because of the stereotypes that we have of the elderly. And it's interesting that this happens even among those people who themselves might be later on in life and might be considered by other people to be old. So yeah, we all are vulnerable to this. One other thing we should remember is that it works in the other direction as well. We can be prejudiced and have stereotypical images of people that are younger than us. And this can lead us to treat people differently because they're younger. I think that as educators we are vulnerable to this, because often in an educator you tend to educate a particular age group, and although you get older, you continue to educate people in that age group, so your students never get any older. They'll always be whatever age group you're typically teaching, even as you get older and older. And I think this leads us into a situation which I have nicknamed Captain Hook syndrome, based on that character from Peter Pan, where we might become resentful towards our eternally youthful students in the same way that Captain Hook is resentful towards the eternally youthful Lost Boys and Peter Pan. And we might see the qualities of their youth as things that we hold against them. Youth is irresponsible, youth is feckless, youth is disrespectful, harmful. And so I think as educators we need to be careful that we don't allow our own stereotypical image of age groups affect the way that we treat students. A common misconception about stereotyping is that we engage in stereotyping when we apply negative characteristics to every member of a group. However, in truth, stereotyping is not about the type of characteristic we're applying to every member of the group, but simply that we're applying that characteristic indiscriminately to everybody. And so we shouldn't assume that stereotypical images are always going to contain negative qualities. It's quite possible for stereotypical images to contain a mixture of negative qualities and positive qualities. It's even possible for a stereotypical image to be made up out of mainly positive characteristics. And these so-called positive stereotypes might at first glance seem to belong in a different category to negative stereotypes. After all, it's hard to see what would be bad about imagining that every member of a group is going to have positive qualities. For people in that group, surely that's a good thing, that everybody will assume you have these positive things about you and view you in a positive way. So surely that kind of stereotyping is to their advantage compared to negative qualities. However, in reality, it doesn't seem to matter whether or not the qualities that you are applying to every member of the group are good or bad qualities. Even good qualities applied indiscriminately to every member of the group seems to have a bad effect. And so so-called positive stereotypes are still harmful. Now, in order to understand why that is, it reveals something deeper about why stereotyping harms us, or why stereotyping can be unhealthy for the people being stereotyped. One of the problems is that no matter which quality or the type of quality that's being applied to you, by expecting everybody to be the same, it ignores people's uniqueness. And that sort of, in a sense, dehumanizes them or reduces their humanity. It makes them look less like a person and more like a part in a machine where all the parts are the same and you can swap one part for another. And because of this, people feel a pressure to live up to the expectation of the stereotype. That if everybody, especially a positive, so-called positive stereotype, if everybody expects them to have these positive qualities, people in that group feel pressured to match those qualities because they're worried that if they don't, by disappointing people, by not living up to the positive quality stereotype, they will be more harshly judged than anybody else would be for not having that positive quality. So if you expect every older person to be patient, you're going to view impatient more negatively in an older person than you would in another person, because you expected older people to be patient, and because they're not living up to that, you'll be more disappointed in them than in other people from other groups. And as a result, people in the stereotype group feel a pressure to live up to the stereotype, so what we sometimes call the stereotype threat. And the other reason why people in the group who are being stereotyped might view the stereotype as a bad thing, even if the qualities of the group, the stereotypical qualities, are supposedly good ones, is that in many cases the supposed positive qualities that we are stereotypically applying to every member of the group might contain a sort of a hidden message or a hidden set of values that we are projecting onto the group which are not positive. Now on the slide I use the example here of the stereotypical image of the Irish. I'm Irish myself, and there's this stereotypical view of the Irish as fun-loving party animals, full of cheer and the crack, and always up for a good time and out for a laugh. Now None of those on first glance appear to be bad things. And so you might wonder, well, why would any Irish person not like that stereotype? Well, a lot of those qualities are associated with sort of a very trivial view of the Irish, essentially that the Irish are not serious people, that they're not able to achieve important things, that all they are good for is to go out and drink and get drunk and party, and that that's their contribution to society, just as kind of light entertainment, not as people who might produce achievements or contributions to society or to civilization which will really matter. And you find that's true with a lot of so-called positive stereotypes, is that they often have a sort of a strings attached which make the positive less positive when you really think about it. But I think the important thing to remember here is that it doesn't really matter whether or not the qualities that you are applying to a group stereotypically are good qualities or bad qualities. The fact that you expect everybody to be the same ignores their uniqueness, which strips them of their humanity, and creates a pressure, a sense of pressure on them to live up to the stereotype. Otherwise, you will and others will be disappointed in them, and they will be harshly judged for it. Now, I said before that we can maintain stereotypical images of an entire social category, an entire group of people, even when our own experiences and the evidence we see contradicts that stereotypical image. But I didn't go into much detail about how that works. I'm going to highlight 3 particular examples of theories which explain how that works in more detail here. The first is confirmation bias, and this describes, if you like, a bias in the way our memory functions, in that rather than us being equally likely to remember anything we learn or anything new information we encounter, we're more likely to remember information and retain it if it is consistent with what we already know, if it fits in with the things we already believe and the things we already know and our view of the world. And this is true in general. It's one of the reasons, for example, the more you study a subject, often the easier it is to learn new things about that subject, because the things you already know help you retain the new stuff. But it means that if you learn something new which doesn't fit with the things you already know, then you're less likely to remember it. It's not that you're deliberately blocking it out or rejecting it, it's just less likely to stick. And this is particularly relevant in the case of stereotypes, because if we have a stereotypical image of a group of people and then we encounter information, we're more likely to remember the information if it's consistent with the stereotype. Now, the classic study by Allport and Postman tested this by showing people a series of cartoon images of encounters, people encountering each other in a city, much like the one that the participants were living in. And they then afterwards asked them to remember or answer questions about the images they had seen. And what they found was that often the people's memory of the images was distorted in ways that was consistent with their stereotypical beliefs. So, for example, the image you can see on the slide here is 2 men having an argument. One of the men has a weapon. It's hard to see in the picture, but it's the man on the left who has the weapon. And the more people remembered that it was the man on the right who had the weapon, because, again, it's not easy to see in the cartoon, but the man on the left is supposed to be white and the man on the right is supposed to be black. And because these people had a stereotypical image that a black person was more likely to have a weapon or use a weapon, they actually remembered the picture as showing the black man having the weapon. And this raises all sorts of interesting questions about people's memory of events, and particularly eyewitness memories about who did what in a critical moment. Their stereotypical beliefs may not cause them to deliberately distort something and say something they don't believe to be true, but might actually cause them to remember things differently in a way that is more consistent with their memory than what actually happened. Another way in which people maintain stereotypical beliefs in the face of contradictions or people who don't fit the mold is by something that's been called a contrast effect. Now, a contrast effect is when describes what happens when people encounter a member of a category who doesn't fit in with the stereotype for the people that they hold for people in that category. And whatever way this person doesn't fit the stereotype, what happens is we find is that quite often people will exaggerate that quality so that it's even more different from the stereotype than it really is. It's almost like they'll turn up the volume on that difference to make it more dramatic. The reason why they might do that is because if they can make the difference between the real person and the stereotype really dramatic, then they can argue to themselves that the real person is a one-off, a fluke. Because look how different they are. Not many people can be that different or have that quality. And so it allows them to believe that the majority of people in the social category still fit the stereotype. So an example of this is Barack Obama. Many people in the US had a view that black Americans were less well educated than the average, and yet here we have a very high profile black American who was very well educated. And what researchers found is that often the depiction of Barack Obama by the people who had stereotypical images of black Americans was to present him as being even more intelligent and even more educated than he actually was, to present him as some kind of genius, because that allowed him to be a one-off, a fluke, and it didn't then disturb their stereotypical image that the majority of black Americans were not well educated. So sometimes we exaggerate. When we meet an exception, we exaggerate how exceptional they are so that it doesn't disrupt our belief about the majority of people in that category, and we can still have stereotypical views of them. The last reason that last way in which we are able to maintain stereotypical views is the grain of truth fallacy. In a sense, often when we encounter exceptions to the rule, we sort of retreat into a position where we say, okay, maybe not every single member of the group is this way or matches the stereotype, but there's probably some people who do. There's at least some members of this group who match the stereotype perfectly. So we believe that, yeah, okay, maybe the stereotype isn't a completely accurate description, but there's a grain of truth to it. Or we might say to ourselves, well, okay, maybe the stereotype image is slightly inaccurate, but at least some parts of the stereotype must be accurate. There must be some truth to it. No smoke without fire. Whereas there's a possibility that none of the stereotype may be accurate. I think the reason we retreat into this position is because we often form stereotypes out of one-off encounters. The grain of truth hypothesis says that sometimes we can meet one or two people who have a certain quality, and then we extrapolate from those one or two people to everybody else in that category. So we might meet one woman who says that they don't like STEM subjects or aren't very good at math, and we then extrapolate from that to assume that most women are like that. And because we sort of allow one instance to form an impression of an entire group, when we encounter contradictions in the group, we fall back on the idea, well, then at least some of them it must be true, because I've met at least one of them for which it's true, so there must be others. I think all of these describe credible ways in which we can maintain a stereotype even when our day-to-day experience and the evidence contradicts it. Time for another activity. This one, I want you to imagine you are working in a school and your class has been reading a book from a series of books about a character called Dr. Drew. And Dr. Drew goes to different places and has different adventures in every book. The book you're working on at the moment is called Dr. Drew Visits Hawaii. And the students are really enjoying the book, but Ofsted is visiting next week and you want to show the Ofsted inspector how dynamic you are by combining the study of literature with a little bit of ICT, computer technology and art. And so you set the students a task to go onto the internet and find images to create a new front cover for this book. So they're just to find a series of cartoon-like images which can be used to create the book, or the front cover of the book. Now at the moment the front cover of the book is an abstract image, it doesn't show anything, but you want them to have a cover that represents what the story is about. So they're to find images, and then once they've downloaded the images you'll print them out and they can arrange them into a visual representation of the cover of the book. Now what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video and I want you to imagine that you are helping these students find these images. So I want you to go onto Google and I want you to find cartoon images which could be used to create a front cover for this story of Dr. Drew Visits Hawaii. Now these are younger children, you can imagine they're sort of Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2, so choose the images that you think would be appropriate for them and would help sort of bring out the story to them. So pause this recording, go and try doing that. Okay, so hopefully you've paused the recording and had a go at this. Now, I can't see what image you've generated, but I'm going to show you a typical image that a lot of educators might help students produce under those circumstances. I wonder if the image you produced looks anything like this. Maybe you didn't choose these exact images, but did you choose something similar? Did you pick images to emphasize Hawaii in some way that highlights the differences? So you're thinking, okay, Hawaii is an island, I better show that it's an island. What has Hawaii got? It's got volcanoes, it's got sandy beaches and surfing. I'll use those. Maybe I'll use one of the people dressed in that traditional outfit with the grass skirt and the flower garland, the lei, so that it's clear where this is happening, so that they don't think this might be happening somewhere else. And similarly, when trying to represent Dr. Drew, did you pick an image of a man? Did you assume that because it's a doctor that it's probably going to be a man, or did you simply go for one of the first images that you found, and the first images produced by the search engine of cartoon images of doctors were images of men? Or did you just pick that because it was the first thing you saw and it was quickest and easiest to put on the screen and do this in a short amount of time? Whatever images you picked, if either of those aspects are true, that you picked images to emphasize the differentness of Hawaii, or that you picked images because they were among the first images that came up in the search, then either of those might be good examples of the ways in which even well-intentioned educators can end up perpetuating stereotypes. The point I'm trying to make here is that we can end up perpetuating stereotypes in the way that we teach certain subjects, not because we believe those stereotypes ourselves or because we're bad or careless people, but because the demands of the situation will often mean we need to do things efficiently. We'll need to make sure we do things in a way that is not more complicated than it needs to be, and that is done in the sort of the smallest amount of time possible, because there will be other competing demands on our time. And small amount of time and doing things simply can end up with us representing things in a way that is stereotypical. Now the example I gave was depicting a foreign country, and often the quickest and simplest way to indicate you're dealing with another culture or another place is to highlight the things about that culture and place that are different from your own culture and where you're from, so that people can recognize, okay, I'm not at home here, I'm in somewhere else, I'm dealing with another group. But in doing so, often that's all we show. So in the example of Hawaii, we show that there are sandy beaches and volcanoes, which do exist in Hawaii, to make it clear that we're dealing with Hawaii and not somewhere more local. But what we don't show is we don't show those parts of Hawaii that look like a lot of other places, suburban places, shops, houses, car parks, supermarkets, which would look very like the ones down the road. And we don't show those because we don't have time, because we don't think that they're necessary, but by only showing the differentness and by taking away the sort of more mainstream elements of that culture or that place, we, what some people call, exoticize those people or that place. We make them look like they're nothing like us because we show no similarities between us and them. And that perpetuates the stereotype of the in-group and the out-group, and the out-group being very different from the in-group. They're not like us. They don't do the things we do. Whereas in fact the truth is probably they're very like us. There are elements that are different, but if those are the only elements we see, we don't see the similarities. And the other thing that often we do when we very quickly and very basically represent another group or people is that we only show a limited variety of representations of those people, which again homogenizes them, makes them all look the same. Again, another feature of stereotyping, that everybody in the group is the same. Or we don't offer any kind of context for why the differences are different. So we may show that a culture is different and does things differently for us, but don't show why that's the case. We show they dress differently, but don't explain why they dress differently, how it reflects differences in climate, for example, or historical differences. And so by stripping away all of the variety within the group and all the way in which their group is similar to our group, and by presenting the differences without any context, the effect is then to perpetuate the stereotype. And I need to emphasize yet again, this can happen not because the people doing it believe the stereotype or don't care about the stereotype, but because the pressures of the job mean that they feel they have to do something simply and quickly. And I guess the lesson to be learned here as an educator is that there is such a thing as doing something that is too simple and too quick, even if those things are efficient, if the danger is that they may then feed into a stereotype. What this shows us is that stereotyping is deceptively easy of a trap to fall into. It's something that you can accidentally do simply because you're too busy, or you sort of got too many demands on you and your time to take the necessary precautions to prevent it. But this then raises an uneasy question. Does that mean that effectively stereotyping is inevitable? I mean, after all, there are a lot of people out there who say, often some of the same people who are the most stereotypical in their own views and language about others, who will want you to believe that we all do it. Everybody's a little bit racist, everybody's a little bit prejudiced or stereotyping of others. Are they right? I mean, is it something that you can't prevent even if you want to? Now, the answer to that is complicated. Firstly, it is very, very difficult to avoid stereotyping, partially for the reasons I've already mentioned in terms of the difficulty in doing it when you've got a lot of demands on your time and a lot of things pulling you in different directions. But also, even if you are trying to be careful and avoid stereotyping, some of the things you might choose to do or try to do to minimize it or reduce it can have the opposite effect, or just not as good an effect as you think they will. One of the central problems here is that often the activation of stereotypical perspectives or viewpoints on a group of people happens at an automatic level. Sometimes people would think of it as a sort of an unconscious level, something you're not thinking about. An example of that is the Divine study, where they got people to memorize lists of words. Now, what the people didn't know was that within the lists there were a lot of words which were linked to a stereotypical image or stereotypical images of a certain social group. They then showed people pictures of that social group in ambiguous social situations, got them to interpret the pictures, and the people who'd been asked to memorize the words which contained a stereotypical image of this group of people were more likely to interpret the ambiguous images in line with the stereotypes. So even though they hadn't realized that they'd been sort of programmed in this way or primed in this way by being shown the lists of words, it still had the effect of making their viewpoint more stereotypical. And it's the fact that you can often not know what's going on in the background that makes stereotyping very hard to control. Other reasons why stereotyping is hard to control is that sometimes the most straightforward solutions you might try to use will have the opposite effect. So you might think, well, we'll just introduce a rule that says nobody can ever stereotype and get everybody to make sure they're always thinking about avoiding stereotypes. Problem is that approach can result in what we call a rebound effect, where an attempt to think about something less actually causes you to think about it more. Another option you might think is, well, what about these people who say stereotyping is inevitable? Maybe if we all admitted that, we would be able to manage it. The problem is that this has also been tried, and it's been found that if you tell people that everybody stereotypes, that actually increases the level of stereotypical thinking that they exhibit, not decreases it. So it's almost like telling people that everybody stereotypes is a bit like saying it's okay to stereotype, don't worry about it, and so people try less hard to avoid it. Another reason why stereotyping is so difficult to control is that some people who are the most likely to think in a stereotypical fashion, who are effectively the most stereotypical in their own thinking, are also the same people who are the worst judges of their own level of stereotypical thinking. And this is based on something called the Dunning-Kruger model, which is a more general model to explain the relationship between competence, how good you are at something, and confidence, how much you think you can do it. And generally, competence and confidence are positively related. The more competent you are, the better you are at doing it, the more confident you are. But Dunning-Kruger found that at the lower end of the scale, the people who were least able, least competent, had way higher levels of confidence than they should. And Dunning-Kruger concluded that these people were so poorly able to do this task, they were also poorly able to judge their own abilities. And that's why they had more confidence in their own abilities than they should. And when you apply this to bias, it suggests that the people who are least able to control their own stereotypical thinking are also the poorest judges of their abilities, and so overestimate how good they are at controlling their stereotypical thinking. Now, all of that would give you a very pessimistic viewpoint and might make you sound like the people who say that everybody stereotypes are right. They're wrong. All this shows us is that avoiding stereotyping is very difficult, that there is no quick fix. But that's not to say there's nothing you can do at all. In fact, there are many things that you can do both as an individual and as an educator to manage stereotyping better. What can be done? Actually, there are a number of things we can do, and while none of these should be seen as a silver bullet solution to fix all forms of stereotyping on their own, each of these, possibly in combination with other activities, can have a meaningful effect in reducing the level of stereotypical thinking that people engage in. Now, one of the interesting strategies seems to be to get people to imagine either that they are in the group that they've previously been stereotyping or that they are meeting them for the first time, and to imagine what it would be like to be in the group or to imagine what it would be like to meet the group. And research which has done this, gotten people to take on the perspective of another group or to imagine what it would be like to meet them, has found that these sort of imagery-based techniques have a really meaningful impact in reducing the level of stereotypical thinking by the people who've engaged in these techniques afterwards. So it seems that even just using our imagination to try and imagine what it's like for the group helps us to have a more realistic viewpoint of that group and what life is like for them. Another factor which does seem to matter, and this is essentially the other half of the point I made previously about what happens if you sort of throw your hands up and go, everybody stereotypes. Doing that makes it worse, whereas on the other hand, if you emphasize that fairness and equality are standards, norms within your group, that creates a powerful motivation for most people to want to follow those rules and adhere to them, even when nobody else is around. Rules we might follow when people are watching, but if we can establish that something is a norm, essentially a basic value of the group, then people will do that even when there isn't anybody else around. And so I think it's important that we always promote these ideas of not stereotyping, of seeing everybody in a fair and equal manner as standards within our society, because doing that is more than just being politically correct. It has a real impact on the way that people behave. Now, another way that we could come at this problem of trying to reduce stereotyping is to get people to become more aware of their own thought processes and how those processes work, and also the strengths and weaknesses of their thought processes. I mean, this is the sort of thing that anybody studies psychology is doing as part of their studies, but for the rest of the world, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about how they think. And the Weston Eaton study found that simply making people sort of aware of bias out there, sort of providing them with information about bias, doesn't work enough on its own. You also need to train them with techniques for managing bias, things they can do to reduce their own level of bias. And this is what Dunning-Kruger found had a real impact on the problem they were seeing, which is people's ability to judge their own competence. And essentially West and Eaton are saying we should be doing the same thing with helping people with diversity training and avoiding stereotypical thinking. It's not enough to simply tell them that there are biases out there or that biases can happen. You also need to provide them with practical steps that they can do to manage their own thinking and to be able to control their own cognition. These are metacognitive skills. And if you can do that, they believe you'll have a real impact on the levels of people's stereotypical thinking. What's the take-home message here? Well, you can see summarized on the slide a number of the key points that I've been trying to get across throughout this part of the presentation. I think it's important that we are realistic about what stereotyping is, that it's not just sort of a bad behavior done by bad people or a simple mistake that can be easily avoided. It's very much a vulnerability that's woven into certain processes and methods that we use in everyday functioning, so not easily avoided. And there are definite challenges to managing it due to the way that it activates and the things that make it more or less likely. However, we shouldn't abandon ourselves to the idea that it has to happen, and instead, as educators, we should be aware that there are practical things we can do, both in terms of the way we organise our lessons, but also on particular methods we can use within our classroom and within the education that we deliver to help other people manage their own stereotypical thinking and avoid it or minimise it in all but the most exceptional circumstances. But of course, stereotyping is just one half of the puzzle. As I said at the start of this presentation, the other half is the thing that arises from stereotyping, and that's prejudicial behaviour. If we don't manage stereotyping, if we don't keep it to the bare minimum in all but exceptional circumstances, what can happen? Well, sometimes nothing. Stereotyping does not inevitably lead to prejudice. However, under the wrong circumstances, stereotyping then becomes the fuel that feeds the fire of prejudicial behaviour when we treat people differently based on which social group or category they belong to. Now, if stereotyping is the fuel, what's the spark? What sets it all off? And if we do find ourselves facing situations of people who act in a prejudicial manner, what can we do about it? Well, that's the topic for the next presentation, which is on prejudice. Thank you for listening to this one. I hope you found it interesting.